Hello and welcome to the Microshift Podcast. I'm your host, as always, Nick Volinchak. That's Nicky V if you're nasty. And I'm excited because this is really the launch of what I hope will be a podcast that will help people see the world a little bit different and really focus on understanding how important those little conversations we have in life are. And the reason I say that is because really at the end of the day, it was 5 in the moment, small, innocuous conversations that you really wouldn't have assumed were that important to the overall construct of my life. But it made the entire difference of changing not just my mentality, but getting me out of a point where I was doing almost irreparable damage to myself and everyone around me, and allowing me to become a functional member of society. And maybe even more than that, I think, as we get into the conversation, and this is meant to be like an introductory podcast, who I am, who's inside of me. But let's start at the beginning. I was brought up in an upper middle class household, mother, father, a brother or sister who were twins, and everything was basically normal. I played baseball, went to school, had friends in the neighborhood. The first 8.5 years of my life were as picturesque, short of a picket fence, that one could possibly ask for. And then in the snap of a finger, everything changed, because in 1992, Labor Day weekend, we took a trek up to Niagara Falls for really our first family vacation that we've ever done. And, I remember various things about it, and I'm fortunate and lucky enough, even to this day, to still have some video footage that I can look back on and remember these times. I remember this is the coolest story. I remember walking through a hotel, a parking store. I'm not really sure. It was, it had a bunch of stores in it, and I think it was a hotel, and there was a magic kit, and I really, really, really wanted this magic kit, and my dad him-hawed and was like, this is already expensive enough. I don't want to buy a magic kit on top of it. And we walked around for 30 minutes and then came back and it was gone. And there was I asked someone where's the magic kit? And they were like, what magic kit? There was never a magic kit here. I'm sure it was just a joke, but it was always one of those things that I thought to myself, did the magician make himself disappear? But anyway, point being, it was just a situation where things were normal. We were functioning as a normal family. I was a good student. I was smart, which is something we'll get into, because I think there is, I think as time went on, that really was a stigma that kind of held me down, because it had to become my identity. Anyway, we come back from Niagara Falls, and a week maybe afterwards, my mom went to her brother's house and they were going to go out to lunch, and she was sitting in a chair much like I'm doing right now, and went to get up and she couldn't. And now gout runs in our family, so naturally the first instinct was, all right, gout flare up, let's call the family doctor, see about getting you in. Doctor basically tells her yeah, I don't know, that doesn't sound right. Why don't you go to the ER? And I'm not sure exactly how things transpired after that, but within hours, our family was effectively turned upside down, because the doctors came back and, your mom has cancer. And then that diagnosis went from your mom has cancer to your mom has terminal cancer. And we're not expecting more than a couple of weeks of life to come from this. And even for being like a smart and present 8-year-old, it was still soul crushing, because you understand that this person who you're expecting 50 years, 60 years, 70 years of your life to be with is now gone. And not just that, but it is probably the most like stable structure of the nuclear family that we heard about in lore that people don't get to really see presently because of the current state of how we have to live our lives. And it was devastating. And I still remember haunting memories of, the time after this, waking up in the middle of the night because I've heard my dad wailing, crying. And my dad was always a very strong figure. He was a big guy, 225, 6'2", worked out. He was a big guy. And then in addition to that, when the priest came over to talk to us about it, and, my dad was just absolutely broken down crying, like no control, sobbing like a baby. My brother and sister had just turned 5. They don't know what the hell is going on around them. At 8, I understood that death meant that this person who was once here is no longer here. They're not coming back. I don't think I had any deep philosophical debates going on at the moment about, well, what is death beyond the human body and where do we, it was just the factual understanding that my mother was gone and she was not coming back. And the priest put this unfair, what's the right word for it? Like an unfair position for me, and basically said, you have to now be, you at 8 years old now have to be a man and help your dad with your brother and sister. And I felt ready for the challenge, but as the years went on, I really started to understand, like, that's some bullshit to put on an 8-year-old. Like, so I didn't feel like I had the ability to have a life, right? Like, I felt like I had to try to be a kid, but also not be a kid because my dad needed help. And anyway, our home life was just, best described as 4 people, 4 ships sailing in varying directions with no destination. I think a lot of times, if it wasn't for grandparents and aunts and uncles and cousins kind of like jumping in to help things, that things could have gotten a lot worse. And there were some things that weren't great. I dealt with violence. I dealt with, not feeling like I wanted to be here. And that's such a shitty feeling for a kid, that I would rather be out of this place and go be with my mom. And you could start to see how things would shift. My behavior went from being a very calm child to being someone who just wouldn't take shit from people, and I was willing to be aggressive, and to be fair and honest, I still am. And I have really good restraint at 41 years old, and am not repeating the sins of the generations before me with my children. But I remember getting into fights at school and just always being willing to like throw down to kind of maybe make other people see that you just don't fuck with him unless you want punched in the mouth. And it was in truth something that, when I went from a 12-person Catholic school to a 250-person middle school in an upper middle class area, it was probably the hardest thing I had to deal with, because I not only not know anyone, but now you're putting someone in a situation, we're all going through puberty, plus these kids are all clicked up. And to be realistic and fair about the situation, Canfield was like really a prime area for there to be cliques, upper middle class area, but you still had people who were not as wealthy as other people, and they kind of stood out like a sore thumb in some cases. And I was in a weird position, because even though my dad was making good money, my grandma was sure as shit dressing me in the finest Kmart linens, and I looked every bit of it. So I think when I went into school and not knowing really how to act around people, it made it tough for me to fit in. And I think it took time until high school till I was really able to like fit in. And a lot of that revolved around drugs and alcohol. And, it was a weird time in life where everything kind of coalesced in a really bad way, because and I love my friends that I had as my first like group of friends in Canfield, but we were going to punk rock shows and metal shows and Ozfest, and I was really passionate about it. But at the end of the day, you just looked around and it was a basement with 8 dudes hanging out. And you're watching on TV and the movies, and you're seeing things like Can't Hardly Wait and Clueless and the American Pie movies, and like, this is what high school is supposed to look like. And I'm looking at my own personal life, and the pieces of the puzzle just don't fit, right? What I'm doing and what I see as being what high school is supposed to be like, they're not the same thing. And so I started getting more into drinking and then smoking weed, and then who would have thought, like, that kind of brought me out of my shell, and people were like, hey, this kid's not as fucking weird as we thought he was. And I start going to parties and making friends, and by the start of my senior year, I'd gone from 8 guys into a basement to not really being willing to hang around with them at all, because I had achieved in my mind what my goal was, which was living this faster high school life. And I remember like people would meet me, I'd spend very little time with them, and they'd be like, yeah, dude, Volinchak is a lot cooler than we thought he would be. And I remember getting a cell phone and how quickly the list of people I had on my cell phone just grew and grew and grew and grew and grew, and how excited I was. And it all had to do with this, drinking and partying lifestyle that I was living. But pretty quickly into things, it turned from being, drinking and having fun to, I have to do this. This is how I have to live. And it became waking up and needing to do Xanax and Coke, and eventually, finally, kind of the big one ended up becoming Oxycontin. And before long, like, I didn't recognize the person who I was, and I was just running on like emotion and drugs, lots and lots of drugs. And I'm lucky enough, I'm one of the few that I know that was lucky enough to not have decades of this abuse. And that, for me, it was basically like a 5-year process from where I started kind of doing stuff to the point where I ended up as a bottomed out drug addict and homeless by the time I was 21 years old. And I hurt a lot of people on the way. I mean, I hurt everyone on the way. And it says everything you need to know about what addiction is when a human being goes to their grandparents' door after having stolen money out of their drawers, and, your grandmother opens the door and says, we don't want you to come around here anymore. And you're emotionless. And in the moment, you just look at her and you're just kind of like, okay. Like almost as if you expected that this day was going to come eventually. and just getting back in your car and literally, not just for the sake of being dramatic on this podcast, but I could tell you that I felt nothing. I didn't care. It did not matter to me. It was like, well, okay, that's one avenue that I no longer have to be able to enable me or to, provide me an opportunity to take something from them in order to get, drunk and or high. And I mean, the last month of my life before ending up at the rescue mission was as chaotic as you could possibly imagine. I end up having a restraining order from my father, so I can't stay there. So I'm living in my car, but I also have no license or insurance on the car. So I'm constantly dodging police activity, trying to stay out of the way of things, but you also just can't post up shop and live at Walmart or Kmart or whatever was open 24 hours a day that you could park your car at and then hopefully sleep there. So it made it extremely challenging to get around, but eventually everything kind of broke and I lost that, and I was faced with the reality of, you have in 21 years, but more realistically in 5 years, managed to lose absolutely everything that you had in your life. And we're not just talking about the materialistic things that we have. We're not even talking about the sustenance things like food and a roof over your head and things like that. But you're talking about your entire support structure where you don't have friends that you can count on anymore. You don't have family members that want to hear from you. And when you finally have to sit and I know this is 20 years before it came out, but to quote Taylor Swift, you have to sit there and look at yourself and say, it's me. Hi, I'm the problem. It's me. I bet you didn't think you were going to get a Taylor Swift quote, especially not in the first episode, especially since I'm not really a fan of Taylor Swift. But I've unfortunately heard that song and that refrain over and over again, but it does kind of it personally summarizes exactly the moment that I had to realize that, all this shit going on around me is a byproduct of the decisions that I made. And so that night when the car was taken from me was the first of what I call my 5 microshifts. And there have been more, but these are the 5 that I've kind of determined to be the most sensitive to my story. And over the next 5 podcasts, my goal and my aim is to really go through those 5 things, those 5 unique situations, or the 5 people who really kind of forced a change in my life for the better. Because at the end of the day, what I want to be able to do and what my goal is with the Microshift Project is, yes, I want to be able to talk to people in podcast form. I want to be able to get on stage and share my story. And I was able to do this a few weeks ago at MIT in Boston. And I mean, let's be real and let's be honest. That's one hell of a kickoff. That is basically like becoming a rock star and your first gig is fucking Madison Square Garden. So the gravity of the situation was not at all lost on me whatsoever. Being able to stand in front of people and look at their face as I wove the tapestry of my life through the lens of vulnerability, coupling emotions, having people go from despair to joy, having people with tears in their eye immediately be able to laugh at the random and crazy shit that comes out of my mouth. It let me know that this really is what my purpose is to share this message. And my hope in the long run is that every time I sit down to record, by the time it hits the airwaves, and people get to watch it, that somebody sits back and they don't have to be, and this is the beauty of this. This isn't a podcast for people who were like me, but it is. This isn't for drug addicts or recovering drug addicts, but it is. This isn't for business people who wake up in the morning and they have all this responsibility and they look in the mirror and say, "You are a fucking fraud. You don't know what you're doing." This isn't for them, but it is. This is for everybody because we all deal with this stuff in our lives. Life does nothing but get harder and harder. And you would think with the advancement in technology and all of these wonderful things we're able to do with AI and medical technology constantly streaming forward, but things get harder and harder. I brought up the concept of a nuclear family before, and how I was lucky enough to have a mother who was staying home while our father worked. I don't know, quite honestly, that many people who are in a position where they're able to do that. And a lot of the people who are, it's more of by force than it is by grace. And so these things only continue to get harder and harder for everybody, and we have more and more problems to deal with. And I think the worst thing I saw growing up was the fact, and especially for men, was that you just got to tuck your emotions away and you have to do whatever for your family. And there's an iota of that that's true, but sacrificing your mental health and a lot of times physical health seems like that's the worst thing that you could do for the people who care and rely on you. So I'm happy that in some senses we're in a position in 2025 where people can talk to people like me and share experiences and try to help each other advance. Because at the end of the day, whatever side of the aisle you're on, whatever your religious beliefs, whatever it might be, we're all here on a very short journey. And I would like to think that together we could make it as easy on each other as possible. So what's the plan here? Well, my plan is here, like I said, the next 5 podcasts, I'm really going to dedicate each one to my 5 microshifts. Okay? We're going to talk about strangers who stopped and didn't have to. We're going to talk about a police officer who could have been a real dick, but was really willing to see past the criminal and see the human. We're going to talk about the man who forced me to hold up a mirror and see what I was. We're going to talk about the friend that I couldn't save. And we're going to talk about the man who really helped bring it all together. And then past that, what I want to do is bring on other people. And here's the best part. I'm not shooting to get the Mark Cubans, the Steve Jobs. Oh, he's dead. I should rest in peace. The Bill Gates, the big name people. If that happens, that's great. I'm going to talk to my friends. I'm going to talk to other people who have causes near and dear to them, that have a passion, that truly care, that want to make this world a better place. And we're going to sit down and discuss what are those shifts that made them go from a point of inactivity to saying the time is now. I have wanted to get on stage and speak for over 20 years. I have wanted to do what I'm doing here right now for 20 years. And I made the mistake of just constantly thinking, I haven't made it that far. I haven't done enough. We are a very materialistic society, so I am not in the millions, and so thus people aren't going to be they're not going to be willing to take me as seriously. And how much of a fool I was, because I would be sitting here on my deathbed at 185 years old saying the same thing. Oh, the goalpost moved again. I need to do this and I need to do that. We all have a story, and you don't have to have something after your name. You don't have to be a doctor. You don't have to be an attorney. You don't have to own multi-million-dollar companies. Some of the biggest lessons, as you will see, I have learned from the most common of men. And that is why I want to bring some of the people who I went through the struggles with on to talk about this, because they have stories too. And maybe hearing it from me doesn't do it for you, but maybe hearing it from them will. So this has been a good introductory podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. I will be funnier, I promise you. And I do apologize about the Steve Jobs thing. Sometimes you get going, and I'm like a one-take guy. So even if I make a gaffe like that, I'm really not going to stop. Authenticity is like my number one thing. And so with that being said, I'm not going to take out errors I make. I'm not going to reconstruct something. The goal of this is not to have a beautiful and superficial thing that looks so good on the surface. This is meant to be raw. This is meant to be real. This is meant to hit people in the heart. And so I'm excited. I'm thankful for everybody who's listened to this today. And I will do my best to make sure that we're constantly putting out conversations and content that really make you think and really make you feel. Until next time, this has been the Microshift Project.